Your monthly subscription box from postflybox.com includes all the materials needed to tie a dozen flies, along with some extra goodies. The Gangsta Gurgler is a large, loud, aggressive fly pattern designed to imitate a wounded baitfish noisily swimming close to the water's surface. Start by picking up one of the heavy-duty forged hooks and getting it firmly secured in the jaws of your tying vise. Then, load a bobbin with the spool of 3/0 black unithread. Get the thread started on the hook shank, leaving an eye-length space behind the eye, and take a dozen or so wraps rearward before snipping off the excess tag. Continue taking thread wraps rearward to build up a thread base on the hook shank. End with your tying thread hanging about halfway between the hook point and the barb. Snip a 1-inch square patch of black craft fur free from the backing, then strip out and discard the shorter underfur. Measure to form a tail about 1.5 hooks in length, then transfer that measurement rearward to the location of your tying thread. Start taking thread wraps to bind the craft fur to the top of the hook shank. Make sure it's bound down really well up to about the midpoint of the shank, then snip the excess butt ends off close. Take a few more thread wraps forward to cover up the butt ends, then wrap rearward all the way to the base of the tail. Snip an equal-sized clump of red craft fur free from the backing, and again strip out the shorter underfur. Align the tips of the red fur with the tips of the black fur and begin securing it to the top of the hook shank just as you did before. Here too, snip the excess butt ends off and cover them with wraps of tying thread. Return your thread to the base of the tail. Snip 20 or so strands of red flashabou free from the hank and fold them in half. Snip the fold so you're left with a single segment of around 40 strands. Place the strands against the near side of the hook with the ends extending about 1/2 inch down the tail. Bind the flash to the hook shank, kind of spreading it out both top and bottom as you go. Lift the remainder of the flash up and snip it off close. Flip the snipped off clump around and repeat the same tie-in procedure on the far side of the hook. Ideally, you want the flash to completely encircle the hook. Lift up the remaining butt ends and snip them off close. Relocate your thread right to the base of the tail. Get hold of one of the saddle hackle feathers and strip off the lower fuzzy fibers, then trim the stem off to make it more manageable. With the shiny side of the feather facing you, lay its stem against the near side of the hook and take wraps of tying thread to secure it. You want the feather's fibers to start just back from the tie-in point. Make sure the stem's bound down really well before snipping the excess off close. Get hold of the feather by its tip and begin preening and folding the fibers rearward. Take touching wraps with the feather up the hook shank, preening the fibers back as you go. After 4 or 5 turns, use your tying thread to anchor the feather's tip and snip the excess off close. While doing your best to avoid the hook point, preen the fibers rearward and take rearward wraps of tying thread to pin them back. You shouldn't need many, just enough to keep them angled rearward. This completes the rear portion of the fly. It has both the flash and the movement to make the pattern extremely attractive. Pick up a piece of the red and black craft foam and snip the corners of one end off at shallow angles, like so. With the red side of the foam facing up, secure it to the top of the hook shank with tight wraps of tying thread. You want the straight edges of the foam to begin at the base of the tail. Pull the foam forward, checking to see there are no thread wraps exposed behind the foam. In other words, make sure it's bound down all the way back to the saddle hackle collar. Pluck a really ample amount of black SST dubbing from the packet, then fold it in half. Snip the midpoint to turn the dubbing into one kind of spread out but cohesive clump, then set it aside with an easy reach. Pull down to expose about 4 inches of tying thread and place the middle finger of your left hand on the thread while bringing the bobbin up to form a loop. Flip the bobbin around the 2 legs of the loop and take a few wraps rearward to close it down and secure it. End with your tying thread an eye length behind the hook eye. Reach for the clump of black dubbing and carefully slip it into the loop between the thread strands. You want the dubbing to extend rearward through the loop about 1.5 inches. Use your tying scissors to snip the other end of the clump off to roughly the same length. Pick up a dubbing whirl and insert its hook into the bottom of the loop and remove your finger. Give the dubbing whirl a healthy clockwise spin, which will twist the dubbing into a fuzzy matted rope. Use your fingers, the tips of your tying scissors, or a dubbing needle to tease out the matted fibers. Once you have most of the material teased out, start taking wraps with the dubbing noodle, preening the fibers rearward as you go. Again, it's going to look a bit matted down, but this will be remedied in just a minute. When you reach your tying thread, use it to anchor the loop, then snip the excess off close. Now, go in and tease out the dubbing once again to create a fuzzy kind of swept back body on the fly. Part the dubbing to either side on top of the fly. Pull a small amount of red dubbing from the packet, then pull down on your tying thread. Use the dubbing to create an 1.5 inch long slender noodle. Start taking wraps with the noodle to build up a nice little red accent at the front of the fly. Try your best to keep a bit of open space behind the hook eye. Snip an 1.5 inch length of the monofilament fishing line free from the coil. Place one end against the underside of the hook shank, then take thread wraps to begin securing it. Pull any forward-pointing mono rearward under the thread wraps until it no longer blocks the hook eye. Keep taking wraps to firmly anchor it in position. You can then reach in with your tying scissors and trim the mono off so it extends just past the hook point. This will act as a weed guard for the fly. Position your thread back at the start of the red dubbing, then fold the foam forward, but leave a little rearward slack in the fold. Take a wrap or two of tying thread around the foam, then begin making progressively tighter wraps. Once the foam's well secured, lift the front end up and take wraps around the hook shank behind the eye. Pick up your whip finish tool and use it to perform a couple of whip finishes under the foam and behind the hook eye. Make sure to seat the knots really well before snipping your tying thread free. If the front lip looks too long, give it a little trim, then round the corners off. A drop of head cement or UV cure resin applied to the exposed thread wraps on the underside of the fly will, once cured or dried, greatly help to increase its durability. And that's the somewhat evil-looking Gangsta Gurgler. Try mixing up your retrieve to give it a really erratic motion on the water's surface and be ready for an explosion.